There is a moment, quiet, unremarkable from the outside, when a man walks into a room and everyone in it decides they already know his story. They look at his boots, they look at his jacket, they look at the worn stitching and the faded color and the scuff marks that no polish could ever fully hide. And in the space of 3 seconds, without asking a single question, they have already written him off. They laugh, sometimes out loud, sometimes just with their eyes. A sideways glance, a smirk passed between friends like a private joke that isn't very private at all. They whisper things like, "Where did he get that, and did he find it in a dumpster?" And they feel very good about themselves for noticing. What they do not know, what they cannot see from where they are standing, is where that gear has been. And they don't know about the night it soaked through in a rainstorm at 11,000 feet above sea level, when turning back was no longer an option and moving forward was the only thing keeping a man alive. They don't know about the ice, the cold that gets into your bones and stays there for days, the moment on a ridge when the wind hit so hard that every piece of clothing on his body became the only wall between him and dying. They don't know, because they didn't ask. They didn't need to. They had already decided. This is a story about that kind of silence. The kind a man carries when he has been somewhere most people haven't, done something most people won't, and survived something most people would not have. It is a story about what it feels like to be laughed at, and what it feels like when the mountain finally tells the truth on your behalf. Not every scar is visible. Not every battle leaves a mark that other people can see. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the world catches up, the laugh fades, the smirk disappears, and what is left standing in the room is a man whose worn-out gear has more stories in it than all of them put together. This is that man's story, and it starts the way all the real ones do, with nobody watching. Marcus Webb pulled into the Trailhead parking lot at 5:47 in the morning, and the lot was already half full. That surprised him. It was a Wednesday. Most people with jobs and families and normal lives did not take Wednesdays off to drive 3 hours into the mountains for a multi-day summit attempt. But the cars were there, expensive ones mostly, trucks with roof racks loaded with gear still in its original color, bright and unmarked and clearly fresh out of the box. SUVs with brand stickers on the rear windows like trophies. A few license plates from out of state. He parked his old Tacoma at the far end of the lot, away from the others, the way he always did. Not out of embarrassment, just out of habit. He had learned a long time ago that the beginning of a climb was not the place to talk to people. The beginning was for silence and preparation, and the particular kind of stillness that only comes right before something hard. He got out and opened the tailgate and began laying out his gear. His pack was a battered internal frame model, maybe 15 years old, the kind that the outdoor industry no longer made in that shape. And the black had faded to a kind of deep charcoal. One of the compression straps had been replaced, not with a matching strap, but with a length of nylon webbing he had cut and buckled himself somewhere in the Cascades 4 years ago, when the original had snapped on the second day of a 7-day route. The repair had held. He had never replaced it with anything fancier, because there had been no reason to. His jacket was orange, or it had been orange once. It was now the color of something that used to be orange, a kind of pale amber, bleached by altitude sun, and washed so many times it had gone soft in a way that new jackets never were. The hood drawcord was a different color than the jacket. He had replaced that too, somewhere, sometime, in conditions that made the replacement feel like a small miracle. His boots were the kind that did not look like boots anymore, so much as a record of everywhere they had been. Not dirty, he kept them clean, always, a habit from a guide he had worked under for 2 seasons in his early 20s, who had told him that dirty boots were an insult to the mountain. But worn. Worn in the way that leather gets when it has been flexed and soaked and dried and flexed again for years until it moves the way skin moves, following the foot naturally, requiring no break-in, because there was nothing left to break. He was still laying out his gear, checking his kit with the slow, methodical rhythm of someone who had done this so many times that the checklist lived in his hands rather than his head, when he heard the voices. 3 of them. Young men, probably mid-20s, dressed in gear that still had that particular sheen. The factory sheen. The sheen of things bought last week or last month and never yet tested by anything harder than a trip from the parking lot to the register. Their packs were matching. Their jackets were matching. Everything was the same deep forest green, coordinated in the way that groups sometimes coordinated when they had more money than miles. They were not being cruel exactly. That is the thing about moments like this that people rarely acknowledge. They were not cruel men. They were young men who were excited, who had spent real money on this trip, who were proud of their equipment, and who noticed, the way excited young people notice everything, that the man at the far end of the parking lot looked different from them. One of them said something. The others laughed. And it was not a loud laugh. It was the kind of laugh that is meant to be private, but is not quite private enough. The kind that carries just far enough to reach the person it is about, while maintaining the plausible deniability of not being directed at them. Marcus heard it. He did not look up. He continued checking his gear. He pulled his headlamp from the top pocket of his pack, clicked it on, clicked it off, replaced it. He checked his repair kit. He checked the condition of his crampon attachments. He did the small, quiet, necessary work of a person who was going somewhere real and needed to be ready. What he did not do was explain himself. He had learned this a long time ago. Not as a philosophy, not as a choice he made consciously. It had just happened gradually, the way a lot of the truest things happen, through repetition, through experience, through the slow accumulation of mornings exactly like this one. He had stopped explaining himself somewhere around his 32nd year of life, after a decade of climbs that ranged from the ordinary to the genuinely frightening, and the silence had settled into him the way the mountains had. Quietly, permanently, without drama. The 3 young men with the matching gear loaded their packs and headed for the trailhead, and Marcus waited until they were gone before he hoisted his own pack onto his shoulders, adjusted the hip belt in the practiced way, and followed. The trails started easily. It always did. That was one of the things Marcus had come to love about mountains, the way they did not reveal their nature immediately, the way the beginning was always modest and even generous, and the path wide and well-marked and shaded by trees that made the whole thing feel almost pleasant. New climbers often made the mistake of reading the beginning as a preview of the whole. Experienced climbers knew it was a courtesy. He passed the 3 young men at the first water crossing, 40 minutes in. They had stopped to photograph the creek. Nothing wrong with that. The creek was beautiful, shallow and fast over smooth, pale rocks, catching the early light in the way that water at altitude catches light, sharper and cleaner than light anywhere else. One of them was adjusting the settings on a camera mounted on a small tripod. The others were eating from wrappers that crinkled loudly in the morning quiet. Marcus stepped across the rocks without stopping, without photographing anything, without speaking. Not because he was antisocial, because he was working. There was a difference that most people who had not spent significant time in mountains did not yet understand. The difference between visiting a place and working in it. He did not think about them after that. He was climbing, and climbing had a way of concentrating the mind on exactly the things that mattered and nothing else. The trail steepened after the first hour, then steepened again. The tree line dropped away behind him, and the sky opened up in the way it only did above a certain elevation. Enormous, almost aggressive, blue in a way that the sky at lower altitudes simply was not. The wind picked up, which he had expected. He pulled his hood up, which he had also expected. He stopped for water at a rock shelf with a view back down the valley, and then from up here he could see the parking lot. Tiny now, far below, the cars like bright toys on gray pavement. He could see, if he looked carefully, the approximate spot where the conversation had happened that he had not been part of, but had been the subject of. He drank his water. He did not feel angry about what had happened in the parking lot. He had felt, briefly, the small flat sting of it. The particular sting of being laughed at by people who did not know anything about you, who had decided they knew everything about you based on a jacket and a pack and a pair of old boots. That sting was real. He was not the kind of man who pretended it wasn't, but it passed the way the sting of cold water on your hands passed, quickly, without leaving much. Because here was what Marcus Webb knew that the three young men in the parking lot did not know, and could not know, and would not know until they had spent enough years in the mountains to have their own gear start to look like his. The pack that had made them laugh had been on his back during the worst 48 hours of his life. Not the most dangerous. There had been more technically dangerous moments, but the worst. The kind of hours that redefined, permanently, your understanding of what you were capable of enduring and surviving. He had been caught in a whiteout on a ridge at 13,000 feet. Not a surprise storm. He had known weather was coming, had miscalculated its speed, had made a decision that in retrospect was wrong. He lived with that. The pack had been on his back during the night he spent in a snow trench he dug with his hands because his shovel had gone over the edge of a rock face, along with 60 feet of rope and his right crampon. One crampon. He had made it back on one crampon and one boot he had wrapped in a spare dry bag, secured with the piece of nylon webbing that was still, today, attached to the pack as a compression strap. The jacket had been with him on the route in Patagonia, where the wind had hit 104 kilometers an hour by his estimate. He had no instruments, was estimating from memory and experience, and had blown one of his partners off his feet. Not off the mountain, just off his feet, sideways, 2 meters, into a rock wall. And the partner had broken 3 ribs, and they had descended in a situation that Marcus did not enjoy thinking about even now, 10 years later. The boots had been on his feet at the summit of 5 peaks above 5,000 meters, including one summit that he had reached alone, in conditions that had turned the 3 other members of his team back, which was a decision he had respected because it was the right decision for them, and which he had not shared with many people because the kind of person who shared stories like that at every opportunity was not the kind of person Marcus wanted to be. He did not think about any of this while standing on the rock shelf drinking his water. He didn't need to. The gear knew, and in a way that was not mystical, not spiritual, just practical and true. The mountains knew. And he put his water bottle away and kept climbing. The wind came harder after midday, which was normal for this range, this time of year. He pulled his layers on with the efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times, who did not need to stop and figure out what order things went in or how to work a zipper with cold hands because cold hands were not an emergency, just a condition, and conditions were what you managed. He made camp in the early afternoon at a flat section of ridge just below the technical section that would begin at first light the next morning. He had been to this spot before. Not this exact mountain, but this kind of spot, this elevation, this quality of light and wind and stone. He knew it the way you knew the neighborhood you grew up in. He set up his tent, old, repaired in 2 places, perfectly functional, and heated water for his meal, and ate watching the light change on the peaks to the east. And the peaks to the east did not care about his jacket or his pack or his boots, and neither did he. Far below, somewhere on the trail he had climbed hours ago, the 3 young men with the matching green gear were moving upward, taking their photographs, eating their wrappers, making their way toward something that was still, for them, entirely unknown. Marcus Webb finished his meal and cleaned his cup and got into his sleeping bag as the last light left the sky. He was asleep before the dark was complete. Tomorrow was the technical section. Tomorrow was where gear got tested, where decisions mattered, where the mountain asked the kind of questions that equipment answered for you. Quietly, without words, like in the way that things built for real use answered real questions. Tomorrow was not tonight's problem. Tonight's problem had been the ascent, and the ascent was done, and the worn-out pack that had made 3 young men laugh in a parking lot was leaning against the outside of his tent, holding its shape in the wind the way it always had, the way things that had been tested held their shape. Perfectly. The morning came in hard, not the soft mountain morning that appears in photographs. Blue sky, golden light, frost catching the sun like scattered diamonds. This was a gray morning, a flat sky morning, the kind where the cloud ceiling sat low enough that the peaks above camp were fully hidden, and the wind moved in the specific restless way that experienced climbers recognized as a morning that required a decision. The Marcus was up before full light. He had slept in segments, the way he always slept at altitude. Not poorly, just differently, the body doing its adjustments, acclimatizing in the way it knew how without being asked. He boiled water and made coffee and stood outside the tent with his cup and looked at the sky for a long time. He was not looking for reassurance. He was looking for information. There is a kind of weather literacy that takes years to develop, that cannot be learned from an app or a forecast or a YouTube video, that lives entirely in the accumulated experience of standing in places like this and watching what happens. The shape of the cloud, the direction of the wind and its inconsistency, whether it was gusting in patterns or gusting randomly. The color at the edge of the cloud ceiling and where it met the rock of the upper ridge. The pressure in the air that you felt in your chest before you felt it anywhere else. What he saw told him. Possible window. 2, maybe 3 hours before the weather made its next move. Not a guarantee. Not even close to a guarantee. But a window. He made his decision the way he made all his decisions in the mountains. Without theater, without drama, without the internal monologue of someone narrating their own bravery to themselves. He finished his coffee. He packed his camp in 22 minutes. He put on his helmet and his harness and racked his protection and began moving toward the technical section as the gray morning began its slow and unconvincing brightening. He had been climbing for 40 minutes, moving well, when he heard the voices below him. He looked down. The 3 young men from the parking lot, the ones with the matching green gear, had made camp lower on the ridge, he now understood. He could see them, maybe 300 meters below, small against the landscape, moving along the approach trail toward the base of the technical section. They were moving at a reasonable pace. Their gear was bright against the gray rock. They were roped together, which was correct, and they were moving in the correct order, which told him they had some training. He looked at the sky again. Then he kept climbing. The technical section of this route was not the hardest climbing he had ever done. That was not a boast. It was a calibration. He had done harder, much harder. This route was rated in the moderate range for alpine terrain, which still meant mixed rock and ice, which still meant crampons and axe and real exposure and real consequences for errors. Moderate in the mountains was not the same word as moderate anywhere else. He moved steadily, placing protection where it was needed, not where it felt good to place it. This was a discipline that had taken years, the discipline of not wasting gear or energy on protection that was psychologically comforting rather than mechanically useful. Each placement was a decision, and each decision cost time, and time on a mountain with a weather window was the one resource that did not come back. He was 60 meters up the technical section, on a ledge system that allowed him to pause and take stock, when the wind changed. Not dramatically, not in the way that novices imagined wind changing in the mountains. See, with a sudden gust that announced itself and left no room for ambiguity. It was subtler than that. The inconsistency shifted. The randomness resolved into a pattern he recognized. The gusts were coming from a new direction, from the northwest, and they had a particular texture to them, a cold wetness that was not quite precipitation but was the thing that happened just before precipitation. He looked at his watch, looked at the ridge above him, looked at the sky. He had been in situations before where the honest calculation told him to go back, And he had gone back, and he had not been ashamed of it, because survival was not a failure condition. He had also been in situations where the honest calculation told him the window was still open, and he had moved forward, and both things, the retreat and the advance, had been made with the same information-based clarity rather than the fear-driven decision-making that got people killed in the mountains. He calculated now. The summit was perhaps 90 minutes above him in current conditions. The weather was deteriorating, but had not yet deteriorated. The ledge he was on provided a solid anchor. He had the gear for the next section. His body was performing well. No altitude effects beyond the normal. No unusual fatigue. The slightly elevated processing of high-altitude thinking that he knew to account for. He moved forward. 40 minutes later, he heard the shout. It came from below and to his left, muffled by the wind and the rock, but unmistakably human and unmistakably urgent. He could not make out words. Then he clipped himself to a horn of rock and leaned out as far as his anchor would allow and looked down the face. One of the three was off the route. Not fallen. Not yet. Not as far as he could tell. But off the route, on a section of rock that was steeper than it looked from below, in a position that was technically manageable but psychologically awful, the kind of position where freezing was a real possibility, and freezing at altitude with weather coming in was not a situation that resolved itself. Marcus did not pause to deliberate. He did not feel heroic. He did not feel anything except the immediate practical clarity of someone who had trained for this possibility, had led alpine rescue work for 3 seasons in his early 30s, and understood that the space between a person being afraid on a rock face and a person being in real danger was a space that could close very fast. He descended, not recklessly, carefully, in the controlled, methodical way that descending alpine terrain required, reversing his protection as he went, moving quickly, but not faster than correctly. His worn crampons bit the rock and ice the way they always had. His old axe found placements the way it always had. His faded jacket shed the first fine spits of precipitation that were now beginning, the outer fabric doing exactly what it had been built to do, even after all the years it had been doing it. He reached the man in 11 minutes. His name was Kyle. He was 24 years old, which Marcus learned in approximately the first 30 seconds of being on the same piece of rock as him. He was not injured. He was frightened, properly frightened, in the way that was healthy and correct and meant his brain was working. But he had frozen on a move he didn't trust, and his partners below him were too far and too inexperienced to assist from their position, and the weather was now making decisions for all of them. Marcus did not introduce himself. There was no time for that, and it did not matter. He talked Kyle through the move, quietly, specifically, without the false cheer that unconfident people used when they were trying to manage someone else's panic. And the instructions were technical and precise and delivered in the tone of someone who had said variations of these exact words to people on rock faces more times than he could count. Wait here, hand here, commit your foot, trust the placement, move. Kyle moved. Then they descended together, Marcus below him, talking him through each section, and they reached the other two, whose names were Derek and Sam. And Marcus looked at the 3 of them and at the sky, and said the thing that needed to be said. "We're going down." Derek started to object. He had that particular energy of a young man who had invested money and anticipation and pride into a summit, and was not ready to release it yet. Marcus looked at him and did not argue. He said it again, once, in the same tone. "Now we're going down." There was a moment, a few seconds, and then Derek nodded. Because even Derek, who had laughed in the parking lot that morning at a man's worn-out pack, could feel what the sky was doing and could hear in the voice of the man next to him the difference between someone who was choosing caution out of fear and someone who was choosing it out of knowledge. They descended together. The weather came in properly about 40 minutes into the descent. The wind going hard and sustained, the precipitation turning from spits to something with more intention behind it, visibility dropping from the wide panoramic clarity of a good mountain morning to the narrow tunnel of a whitening sky. Marcus kept them moving. He set the pace, which was faster than they were comfortable with and slower than panic would have taken them, which was exactly right. He had been on this ridge in this kind of weather before. Not this specific ridge, but this kind of ridge, this kind of weather, this specific quality of deterioration that turned a moderate route into something else. The knowledge was in his body more than his mind. Not memory, exactly, but the physical understanding of how to move, where to step, how to read the rock under a layer of new precipitation. His boots found the holds. His jacket kept the wind out. His pack, which had made 3 young men laugh 8 hours ago, rode steady on his back and contained everything they collectively needed to manage this descent, because he had packed it the way a person packed who was not performing for an audience but preparing for a mountain. They reached the camp zone, what was left of it, battered by the wind, in the early afternoon. The weather was now fully committed to being bad. The sky had gone flat and gray and close, and the peaks above them had disappeared entirely. Marcus helped them set anchors for their tent in conditions that would not have held a tent without anchors. He checked their shelter. He checked their fuel supply and their food. And then one of them, Sam, the quietest of the 3, the one who had been the least vocal in the parking lot, looked at Marcus's pack leaning against the rock where he had set it, and looked at Marcus, and said something that he said plainly and without calculation because he was tired and frightened and grateful in the uncomplicated way that people became grateful when something real had just happened to them. He said, "What happened to your pack?" "It's been through something." Marcus looked at the pack, at the faded black, the replacement strap, the worn buckles, the scuffs from 100 approaches on 100 different types of rock. "Yeah," he said. He did not say anything else, and Sam did not ask anything else. Because somehow, in the stripped-down quiet of a high camp in bad weather, with the wind working against the tent fabric and the peaks hidden and the summit gone for today, the answer was already there. In the pack, in the jacket, in the boots. In the fact that Marcus Webb was on this ridge and they were still on it with him, and not somewhere on the face above looking at a deteriorating sky with no idea what to do next. The answer was in all of it. Sam nodded, and that was enough. The storm lasted 31 hours. That was not unusual for this range in this season. It was also not comfortable. It was the kind of 31 hours that the mountains occasionally handed to people as a kind of assessment. Not maliciously, not with any intention at all, because mountains had no intentions, which was one of the things Marcus had always appreciated about them. The assessment was simply there, the way all honest tests were simply there, and what it measured was not courage or ambition or how expensive your equipment was. It measured preparation. It measured patience. It measured the ability to be still when stillness was the correct response, and to act when action was required, and to know without anyone telling you, without any external validation. Which was which? Marcus spent those 31 hours the way he had spent many hours in similar conditions. He slept when he could. He ate on schedule because eating on schedule at altitude was not a comfort. It was maintenance. He monitored his shelter. He checked his gear with the regularity of a man for whom checking gear was not anxiety but practice. The calm, repetitive practice of someone who understood that small problems caught early remained small, and small problems ignored became emergencies. He also, because there was time, and because the particular interior quiet of being weathered in at altitude had always been one of the places where his thinking was clearest, thought about the parking lot, not with bitterness, not with the desire to construct some imaginary confrontation where he laid out all his credentials and watched the expressions on their faces change. That kind of thinking had never appealed to him. It was the thinking of a person who needed to be seen, and Marcus had made his peace a long time ago with the fact that the mountains did not care whether he was seen, and therefore neither mostly did he. What he thought about was simpler. He thought about what those three young men had been doing in the parking lot. The thing underneath the laugh, the thing the laugh was actually about. Because the laugh was never really about his gear. The laugh was about the gap between what they had spent and what he had spent. The laugh was about their shiny new equipment, reflecting back at them the image of serious mountain people, and the image of people who belonged here, and the brief, uncomfortable disruption of seeing someone who did not match the image, but was clearly going to the same place they were going. The laugh, in other words, was about fear dressed up as superiority. He had been 24 once. He had had that particular flavor of fear. The fear of not being taken seriously, of not belonging, of having made a significant investment of money and identity and excitement only to be revealed as an amateur by someone who knew more. He had managed that fear differently than they had, but he had had it. It was a human fear. It was not interesting to hold against anyone. And what was interesting, what he had spent years thinking about in the specific way that mountains gave you time to think, was the question of what happened to a person on the other side of that fear. What happened when enough time passed and enough hard things happened and the gear started to get old and the resume of difficult places started to accumulate, and the question of whether you belonged had simply been answered so many times by the mountains themselves that you stopped needing anyone else to answer it. What happened in his experience was a particular kind of quiet, not arrogance, not the performance of humility either, that performative modesty that was really arrogance wearing better clothes, just quiet. The quiet of someone who knew what they had done and where they had been and did not need the knowing to be witnessed. He had met people in the mountains who had that quiet. Some of them were famous climbers, names in the guidebooks, people who had done routes that made other experienced climbers fall silent. Some of them were completely unknown. Local guides, park rangers, the kind of people who spent their lives at altitude not because it made them famous, but because it was the only place that made sense to them. They all had the same quality, something settled, something that had been tested enough times to know its own shape. That quality was what the young men in the parking lot had seen, even if they hadn't known what they were seeing, and something about it had made them uncomfortable enough to laugh. On the second morning after the storm, and the sky cleared in the absolute and generous way that mountain skies cleared after a serious system passed. No ambiguity, no hedging, just blue so pure and deep that it looked painted, and a stillness that had the particular quality of a space that had just been swept clean. Marcus packed his camp methodically. He assessed the route above. The storm had added fresh snow to the upper section, which changed the conditions, added time, added uncertainty about what lay beneath the new surface. He made his calculations. He looked at the sky. He looked at his watch, and at the sun's position, and at the amount of daylight that was likely available. He consulted nothing outside his own experience. He had no signal up here, no weather app, no second opinion from a more experienced person, because there was no more experienced person currently on this mountain. He moved up. The technical section was different now. The holds and features he had identified 2 days ago partially buried or altered by the new snow. He moved carefully, testing each placement before committing weight, reading the rock beneath the white surface the way you learn to read it after years of practice. His crampons were not new crampons. They were crampons that had been on his feet in conditions this difficult and worse, and the points were still sharp because he kept them sharp, and the frame was still solid because he had maintained it, and they bit the new snow over old ice and held him the way they had always held him. He was 300 meters above camp when he heard movement below him. He paused on a solid ledge and looked down. Sam was climbing. Alone, the other two he had gathered from brief conversation at camp had decided the summit was not the right outcome for this trip, which was a mature decision and one Marcus respected. But Sam was climbing methodically, in the careful way of someone who was not very experienced but was paying attention. Marcus waited. He had not been asked to wait. He was under no obligation to wait. The summit was his, and he had earned his way to it through 20 years of this specific kind of work, and waiting for a stranger on a technical mountain was its own kind of risk. He thought about this for about 30 seconds, watching the young man move below him, and then he stopped thinking about it. Sam reached the ledge, breathing hard, but not dangerously hard. He looked up at Marcus, and the look on his face was not the look he had had in the parking lot 2 days ago. It was the look of a person who was somewhere extremely difficult and was genuinely uncertain whether he should continue, and was, for perhaps one of the first times in his adult life, without any performance or mask or social management, simply asking. Marcus looked at him, the way he had climbed, the decisions he had made to get to this ledge, the gear he was carrying and how it was arranged, the expression on his face. "You've been watching," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Everything," Sam said. "Since the parking lot." There was a pause. The wind moved across the ledge, cold and clean. "Stay close," Marcus said. "Match my pace. Don't get ahead of your feet." They climbed together. Now Marcus did not explain each move as he made it, the way he might have with a client on a guided route. He moved, and Sam watched, and Sam moved. When there was something specific to communicate, a hold, a placement, a shift in route finding, he said it in the minimal language of technical terrain, the shorthand that the mountains had given him. And Sam listened with the particular focus of someone who understood, in a way that he perhaps had not understood 48 hours ago, that the words meant something real. It took them 2 hours and 40 minutes to reach the summit. The summit was a broad, flat rock shelf with wind and sky in all directions, and the range spread out below them in the way it spread out when you had earned the view rather than been given it. Marcus had been on summits many times, and he never got used to it, not because it always felt new, but because it always felt true. The mountain did not care that you had arrived. It simply was, and you simply were. And there was a kind of honesty in that exchange that he had never found anywhere else. Sam stood on the summit and looked at the world below him and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "How many times have you done something like this?" Marcus thought about it. Not the count. He didn't keep a count, didn't have a logbook the way some people did, didn't need the record. He thought about the first time. He thought about the worst time. He thought about the time in Patagonia and the time in the snow trench and the time he had come back on one crampon and a dry bag, and the dozen other times that had written themselves into his gear and his body and the particular quality of silence he carried. "Enough times," he said. Sam nodded. Then he looked at Marcus's jacket, the faded orange that wasn't quite orange anymore, and at the pack sitting on the rock beside them, and at the boots that had walked up this mountain in new snow over old ice without failing once. "In the parking lot," Sam said. "I was one of the—" "I know," Marcus said. It's fine." And it was. That was the true thing that Marcus had arrived at somewhere in his 30s and had never revised. It was fine. Not because it hadn't stung, not because it didn't matter at all, but because the laugh had happened and then the mountain had happened, and between those two things the entire argument had been settled, clearly and completely, by the only judge that had ever mattered. They began their descent in the early afternoon, the summit behind them and the camp below them, and the parking lot somewhere further down beyond the tree line, 3 hours away, where 2 vehicles waited, an expensive SUV and an old Tacoma with a tailgate that needed a second hit to close. They descended without speaking much. The mountain did not require commentary. What had happened on it in the last 3 days was complete and real, and did not need to be narrated to be true. At the base of the technical section, where the terrain eased and the trail proper began again, Sam said one more thing. He said it to the back of Marcus's faded orange jacket, to the pack with the replacement strap, to the boots that had come this far and were going the rest of the way. Hank, who taught you all of this? Marcus thought about it. The guide in his early 20s with the rule about clean boots, the roots that had taught him things no person could teach him, the storms, the snow trenches, the descents that had no margin for error, the mountains themselves, patient and indifferent and honest in the way that only things without opinions could be honest. The places did, he said, and kept walking. Down through the thinning air, down through the tree line where the shadows came back and the ground softened, down to the trailhead where gravel crunched underfoot and the morning's dew was long dried off the hoods of the cars, down to the parking lot where it had all started, with a laugh, with 3 glances, with a few words that had floated across the morning air and landed on a man who had simply gone on checking his gear. The gear that had held. The gear that had always held. Marcus Webb loaded his pack into the Tacoma, closed the tailgate with the second hit it needed, and sat in the cab for a moment before starting the engine. He was tired in the clean way that hard days in good places left you tired. Not depleted, just settled. The way things felt after they were done and done correctly. He started the truck. He drove home. And the pack rode in the bed of the truck the way it always rode, battered, faded, entirely sufficient, through the mountains that knew its history, down through the foothills, back into the world of people who had not been where it had been, and who perhaps never would be, and who might. Like if they saw it in a parking lot somewhere, be tempted to laugh. That was all right. The pack could wait. It had always been good at waiting.